It is great to have your company here on Business Now. Well, back in 2010, Ken Henry made 138 recommendations about how Australia's tax system could be made fairer, how it could make the country more competitive, and how it could reduce our reliance on income taxes. Well, it was a monumental piece of work, but you could say in hindsight, a complete waste. The recommended changes were greeted on both sides of Parliament with fear and not with ambition. Only a handful of Henry's changes were implemented, and two of those were, in future, repealed. Now, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia wants to rekindle that conversation. It's got a conference in a couple of days' time in Sydney featuring Ken Henry. I spoke earlier with the Chief Executive of CEDA, Melinda Cilento.
Probably not at this particular moment in time, but Ross, I think the challenge for all of us is actually to reignite these conversations in a way where we can build consensus and build some momentum, because we've been talking about the need for tax reform for so long, and the need for it is only getting more and more pressing. And the sooner we act, I think the more options we're going to have to actually get to the right outcome.
So the interesting thing that I find is every time there is a tax change, even proposed, that governments of the day dress it up as tax reform. It's nothing of the matter. It's actually just tinkering at the edges of it. Tax reform is genuinely looking at the way in which federal government interacts with state governments, the way in which the social welfare system interacts with our tax system, and the way in which all taxes actually combined do work themselves out. That's the reason why politicians have such trouble, surely.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, firstly, to your point about the fact that we haven't seen genuine tax reform, that is absolutely spot on. There's been a lot of talk about how changes to personal income taxation have been reformed, but we know that's not the case. We know that we're still relying far too heavily on income tax. We've been talking about this for years. We introduced the GST to help address that, but really we're right back where we were when the GST was introduced. And we do need to see tax reform in the context of what we're raising tax for, but also the incentives that it creates, for the shape of our economy, the type of investment we want, and the transitions that we know are going to happen, whether it's decarbonisation, a shift to electric vehicles, all sorts of things. So we really need to join all of these dots and start looking at the big changes that we need to introduce and communicate them clearly to the community, why we need them and how we're going to manage the implementation of them.
Because there's one other thing that also I observe, and that is Australia has a lack of productivity growth at the moment, which is keeping interest rates higher than what they otherwise would be. Now, I'm wondering whether there is a parallel between that lack of productivity growth and the lack of tax reform, genuine tax reform over a long period of time.
Look, I think I've said previously that one of the messages that's coming through loud and clear from the business leaders that I'm talking to is that they're really struggling to find investment opportunities in Australia. Obviously, tax has got to be part of that mix, and we need to consider whether and how tax reform can improve the investment environment here in Australia. But I think one of the other things we need to call out is that we're raising so much corporate tax from a relatively small number of very large businesses when you look at the proportion of tax raised. And there's some big shifts going on in our economy that we need to be considering in the context of where that revenue is going to come from. So as we look to decarbonise and think about the proportion of tax that's paid today by oil and gas companies, for instance, that's something we've got to be thinking about and getting ahead of. So I think there's a lot in that question, Ross, absolutely needs to be on the table. But we also need to be thinking about the ageing population and how we continue to support workforce participation and a whole range of issues.
It goes to so many political issues. It goes to the issue of negative gearing. It goes to the issue of capital gains tax discounts. It goes to the heart of where is incentive to work harder? Where is incentive to set up a business? Where is incentive to export in this country? These are all the things that Australia requires if it is to be a competitive nation going forward for the next 20 years.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think we need to realise there's only a handful of different sort of so-called tax bases where we can raise revenue. We've been talking about all these issues for so long, Ross, and you know this as well as I do. Simplification, efficiency, how we get a much more efficient tax system. We've had the same answers for a long time. We haven't been able to sort of build momentum around them and consensus around them. And I think that's really what we've got to focus on now. What are the changes we need to implement? Are there new ideas or new issues, particularly around the taxation of income from capital and different sources of capital, and how we actually structure a tax system that we think is creating the right incentives, raising the right amount of revenue, and as you said at the beginning of your comments, Ross, thinking also about what government's spending its money on and how we make sure that that sort of broad social compact is where it needs to be in this country.
And having politicians brave enough to go and enact some of those changes as well and stand by them. Melinda Cilento, always good to chat to you, and I trust that event in a couple of days' time with Ken Henry and many other experts really does spark a little bit of conversation. Many thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.